Number 10. Who Mourns for Adonais? Season 2. Guest starring Michael Forrest as Apollo. An entity claiming to be the Greek god Apollo appears and holds the Enterprise in what appears to be a human hand, but it is in fact a force field. They are introduced to a being that identifies himself as the god Apollo. The landing party would be Captain Kirk, Dr. McCoy, Mr. Chekhov, Mr. Scott, and Carolyn Palamas. She would have knowledge in Greek history. Apollo demands the entire Enterprise crew beam down and worship him. He then says he will destroy the Enterprise once they're all down on a planet. Apollo also takes a liking to Carolyn Palamas, and Mr. Scott would take offense to that, and he would also be punished. The landing party figures out that Apollo is a being that grows stronger with love and attention. And in an attempt to drain Apollo's energy, Kirk tells Palamas that she must spurn Apollo and his advances. Captain Kirk and the landing party try to mock Apollo to get him to expand energy as well. Ultimately, the Enterprise's phasers destroy the source of Apollo's power, and he returns to the heavens, and the Enterprise is free to go on her way. Michael Forrest would also appear in Star Trek Continues and reprise his role as Apollo in the episode Pilgrim of Eternity. Number 9. Mirror Mirror, Season 2. The USS Enterprise is in orbit while Captain Kirk, Dr. McCoy, Lieutenant Uhura, and Mr. Scott are negotiating with the Hulkans. They are negotiating for their supply of dilithium crystals. An ionic storm forces the landing party to beam up. However, during the beam up, we see two different shots of the Enterprise. The regular universe shows the Enterprise from her starboard side, and the alternate universe shows her from her port side. Once the landing party materializes, they discover that the ship is altered. The appearance of the uniforms, parts of the ship, and the mannerisms in which the crew act are all very different. Disobedient crew members are subject to the agony booth, and Captain Kirk is told he must totally destroy the Hulkans for not giving the Empire the dilithium crystals. The landing party quickly realizes that it must be easier for them to fit in the alternate universe than for the alternative universe landing party to fit in a regular universe. In fact, we see the alternate universe Captain Kirk in the brig threatening to have Mr. Spock executed. On the ISS Enterprise, Captain Kirk manages to stall the attack on the Hulkans, but draws increasing suspicion. He also discovers the way the crew moves up in rank is to kill their senior officers. Captain Kirk also discovers that he has a weapon in his quarters that will vaporize anyone that appears on the screen. Of course, he does not use it. And eventually it is the help of the alternate Mr. Spock that helps the landing party back to their own universe via a simultaneous beaming exchange of parties. In his parting words, Captain Kirk informs the alternate universe Mr. Spock of the weapon in his quarters and tells him to push for change of the Empire. Number 8. Whom Gods Destroy, Season 3. On a mission to take serum to help cure insanity, the Enterprise goes to Elba 2, which was the last of the asylum-type facilities housing the criminally insane. Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock beam down. Captain Kirk is told one of his childhood idols, Starfleet Fleet Captain Garth, is there receiving treatment. Governor Corey is there to greet them. It is quickly realized that Governor Corey is in fact Captain Garth, who has mastered altering his appearance to any form he chooses. He shows Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock the real Governor Corey in a cell. Captain Garth also refers to himself as Lord Garth and demands that he is allowed to beam up to the Enterprise as her new captain. Of course, Kirk refuses. Mr. Spock is put into a cell, and Captain Kirk is put in his own quarters. Captain Garth alters his appearance to that of Captain Kirk and contacts the ship. But due to the nature of the facility, a code question was employed to prevent such escapes. Mr. Scott asks the security question, Queen to Queen Level 3. Garth is unable to answer the question, Enraged, he threatens Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock with harm if he is not given the answer. However, they do not comply. Garth decides to have an official ceremony to crown himself as master of the universe. Ultimately, Mr. Spock would escape and find Captain Kirk along with Captain Garth, who is appearing as Captain Kirk to confuse him. Mr. Spock would stun the right one, and after he is told to shoot them both, as that is the only way to ensure the safety of the Enterprise. As Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock prepare to leave, they are greeted by Captain Garth leaving the treatment chair after a treatment, and he appeared calm. He would shake Captain Kirk's hand just before leaving. 7. Elaan of Troyius, Season 3. The USS Enterprise is sent to the Telem system to serve a diplomatic mission which involves the transport of a ruler of one planet to another planet in order to marry its ruler. The Dolmen of Elaan will be transported by the Enterprise to Troyius in order to marry their leader. This is arranged in an attempt to bring the bitter war between the two planets to an end. Troyius has sent an ambassador to greet her aboard the Enterprise, and his name would be Ambassador Petri. He is faced with the monumental task of introducing the dolmen to the custom of Troyius. This proves to be a very difficult task, one that almost takes the ambassador's life. The condescending and pompous behavior demonstrated by the dolmen pushes him to the brink. On the advice of Captain Kirk, Petri attempts to approach the dolmen in a stronger, more forceful way. The result ultimately is him getting stabbed and landing in sickbay. One of the main reasons for the Federation's involvement is the two warring planets are very close to the Klingon Empire in a disputed zone of space. With the importance of the mission's success on the line, Captain Kirk decides to take over for Petri and instruct the dolmen himself. Captain Kirk would touch the tears of the dolmen, which would contain a chemical that would act as a super love potion. So as Dr. McCoy tries to find an antidote for the tears, there is a saboteur aboard the Enterprise, working on behalf of the Klingons. It was later revealed that Crichton, which is the head bodyguard of the dolmen, sabotaged the dilithium crystals in a way that if the Enterprise went into warp, her engines would explode. That was the plan for the Klingon ship that was keeping pace with the Enterprise just beyond sensor range, hoping for when they had approached. Ultimately, Crichton is captured and self-terminates. The Enterprise is saved and the dolmen does indeed beam down to Troyius. After Dr. McCoy finds an antidote for the tears, Mr. Spock informs him that it is no longer needed, that the Enterprise infected the captain long before the dolmen did. Dr. McCoy then says that he doubts there's any type of antidote for the Enterprise, and Mr. Spock agrees with him. Number 6. The Gamesters of Triskellion, Season 2. While in orbit at Gamma 2, Captain Kirk, Lieutenant Uhura, and Mr. Chekhov prepare to beam down. Since Gamma 2 is fully automated, they are preparing for routine maintenance and repairs. However, while in the transporter room, they simply vanish. Mr. Scott reports the incident, and Mr. Spock performs a search of the area, while Mr. Scott does an evaluation of the equipment. While the landing party, unknown to them, appear on a planet called Triskellion. They are met with members of different species that move in on them. Their phasers and communicators are useless, so they resort to hand-to-hand combat. They ultimately become prisoners and are told that they will fight for the amusement of the providers for the rest of their lives. The providers kidnap members of different species from all over the galaxy and enslave them to fight against one another. While this goes on, the providers wager on the fights, with their form of currency which is known as quatlus. The providers refer to the fighters as thralls. They maintain control of the thralls by putting a device around their neck to provide pain when insubordination occurs. The head thrall is known as Galt. Each thrall's collar will be colored corresponding with the particular provider that they belong to. Captain Kirk's drill thrall is named Shauna. Each member of the landing party has a different drill thrall. In the meantime, without finding any trace of the landing party, Mr. Spock sees a small ion trail and decides to follow it. He ultimately finds the landing party and is introduced to the Providers. Kirk later is shown the Providers and discovers that they are brain-like entities living in a case deep below the surface of the planet. Captain Kirk wages his freedom and the freedom of all the thralls against the enslavement of the entire crew of the Enterprise and the battle of the thralls against the landing party. The landing party ultimately wins, and the landing party is free to return to the Enterprise. Along with their freedom, the thralls are also all released. Number 5. The Devil in the Dark, Season 1. The USS Enterprise travels to Janus 6 in order to assist the mining colony there. Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy beam down to meet with the Chief Engineer, Vanderberg, who is the supervisor of the facility. He informs the landing party that there have been mysterious murders of his crew in the deeper levels, where deposits of peridium recently were excavated. The murdered crew members are being totally burned, leaving little behind. Dr. McCoy discovers that it is highly corrosive acid that kills them. While the meeting is taking place, the alarm sounds at the site of the circulation pump. They race to the spot to discover that the pump is missing. Without the pump, fresh air cannot be circulated through the facility, and there is a time limit until the colony must be evacuated. Captain Kirk sends down a security detail into the tunnels. They ultimately come in contact with the creature that has the ability to tunnel through solid rock as easily as the security party walks through the air. Captain Kirk is the first one to encounter the creature. Since the crew of the Enterprise are armed with Type 2 phasers, they are stronger and more effective against the creature. Mr. Spock would later mind meld with the creature, and it is discovered that she would call herself a Horta. She was the last of her kind before the hatching of the eggs, and it was her job to protect them. Her eggs were silicone-based nodules that were collected and destroyed by the mining crew. Once communication was established, they came to a mutual understanding that her eggs would be safe and the newly mined tunnels could be used by the miners. Captain Kirk had injured her with his Type 2 phaser, but Dr. McCoy was able to put a Band-Aid on the wound that would protect it until it healed. One of Dr. McCoy's famous lines came from this task, saying, "I'm a doctor, not a bricklayer." Captain Kirk would reply, "You're a healer. There's a patient." Number 4. The Enterprise Incident, Season 3. In what would appear to be an irritable and fatigued Captain Kirk, he would order the Enterprise through the neutral zone, much to the disapproval of his crew. They would be surrounded by Romulans, which would also be using the Klingon D7 ship design as well. Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock would beam over to the Romulan flagship in an attempt to explain the course taken across the neutral zone and into Romulan space. Mr. Spock explains about Captain Kirk's odd behavior and expresses his concern of mental fatigue the captain was showing. The Romulan commander explains to Mr. Spock that she will escort the Enterprise to a Romulan base for processing, and Mr. Spock agrees. Captain Kirk, enraged, would then attempt to attack Mr. Spock. Mr. Spock would grip his face in what would be described as the Vulcan death grip. This would knock out the captain to the point where he would appear lifeless, but Dr. McCoy would certify him dead. He would beam back to the Enterprise with the captain's body. It was later learned that the captain indeed was alive. The recent behavior was part of the plan in an attempt to obtain the Romulans' new cloaking device. There is no such thing as the Vulcan death grip. Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock were under strict orders of silence. In the event of capture, the captain would be fully to blame, appearing mentally stressed. This would keep the Federation off the hook and prevent interstellar war. The Vulcans are a distant cousin of the Romulans, and the Romulan commander is intrigued by Mr. Spock. She eventually develops feelings for him and spends time with him in her quarters. While this is occurring, Captain Kirk surgically altered to pass as a Romulan. He would beam over to the flagship disguised as a Romulan Centurion. He ultimately would find the cloaking device and beam it back to the Enterprise. Mr. Scott would install the cloaking device as they would attempt to locate Mr. Spock with a transporter. Once Spock was located, he would be beamed back to the Enterprise. The Romulan commander knew the sound of the transporter, and she hugged him and held on as he was beaming back to the Enterprise. Once aboard, Mr. Scott was able to activate the cloaking device, and the Enterprise would disappear. The mission would prove to be a success, and the Enterprise would cross back across the neutral zone and back into Federation space. Number 3. The Tholian Web, Season 3. The USS Enterprise is sent to search for her missing sister ship, the USS Defiant, NCC-1764. Once she is found, she is observed phasing in and out dimensionally. A landing party of Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, and Ensign Chekhov transport to the USS Defiant. To their horror, they realize that the crew has mysteriously killed each other. Once on the bridge, they discover the captain's neck has been broken. Dr. McCoy realizes the ship is phasing in and out and reports to the bridge. Captain Kirk orders the landing party to be beamed back to the Enterprise. However, the transporter is malfunctioning due to the status of the Defiant. Captain Kirk orders the rest of the landing party to beam back to the Enterprise, and he stays behind until Mr. Scott can transport him as well. The Defiant would totally phase out, presumably taking Captain Kirk with her. While attempting to find a captain, the Enterprise would encounter a ship. This would be identified as a Tholian ship, and they insisted the Enterprise leave their space. Waiting for the next interphase, hoping to retrieve Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock is granted an hour for the purpose of intergalactic peace. However, when the hour was up, the Tholian ship fired on the Enterprise. The Enterprise would incapacitate the Tholian ship. However, another Tholian ship would show up, and they would start to build a net around the Enterprise, caging her in a force field. If this wasn't bad enough, it was discovered that the space had an effect on the crew, making them more and more irritable. Mr. Spock would assume command, and in one of the more moving scenes in Star Trek, he would declare Captain Kirk dead. They would watch the video in the captain's quarters, in one of the most sad scenes in any episode. Later, Lieutenant Uhura and Mr. Scott see Captain Kirk phasing. Eventually, Mr. Spock would see him on the bridge as well, and the interphase was located, and the captain would ultimately be saved as Dr. McCoy would find a serum, curing the spatial effects on the crew. Incidentally, the USS Defiant NCC-1764 would also appear in a Star Trek Enterprise episode, A Mirror Darkly. The Tholians had actually taken the Defiant, and she phased out in one dimension and into theirs. Number 2. The Squire of Gothos, Season 1. Guest starring William Campbell as Trelane. On her way to Colony Beta 6 to perform a supply mission, the USS Enterprise would encounter a rogue planet. When they attempt to investigate it, to the bridge crew's horror, Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Sulu would disappear from their positions. Mr. Spock would quickly alter course of the planet, deducing that the captain and lieutenant were taken there. A scan would show an area capable of supporting life. In a landing party consisting of Dr. McCoy, Lieutenant DeSalle, and geophysicist Carl Yeager, they would find a structure that would appear as a castle. When they enter, they discover Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Sulu still in the same position as they were while on the bridge. They also introduced to a man who identified himself as General Trelane, retired. He would release the captain and Mr. Sulu, who would be unaware of their surroundings. General Trelane would inform them that he had been monitoring planet Earth and had been fascinated by it for some time, and when he had seen the ship going by, He just had to bring them to him. He identifies the planet he is on as Gothos. Despite expressing their desire to leave and go about their duties, Trelane insisted that they stay. They informed Trelane that the Earth he was observing was centuries behind where they were presently. The reproductions Trelane created to impress the landing party lacked substance. After learning that they were females on board the Enterprise, Trelane brings down Lieutenant Uhura and Yeoman Ross. After several attempts to break through the force field, Mr. Spock would beam up the entire landing party. When the Enterprise warped out of orbit, Trelane appeared on the bridge, and he would bring the bridge crew to his parlor to celebrate. Captain Kirk would later challenge Trelane to a duel with pistols. And Captain Kirk would fire at the mirror, which seemed to be Trelane's power source. The mirror would be destroyed, showing machinery behind the broken glass. An angered Trelane told Kirk to go back to his ship and that he earned what was to come. But despite trying to escape at warp speed, no matter which direction the Enterprise chose to go in, the planet Gothos would block their path. Irritated, Captain Kirk would beam back down to Gothos, where he would be put on trial by Trelane. Found guilty, we see a noose ready for Captain Kirk. Kirk instead wages the sport of the hunt for himself if Trelane lets the Enterprise go. Later, at the end of the hunt, we learn that Trelane is indeed a child and is scolded by his parents for tormenting the Enterprise crew, as he was brought back. He would later be described by Captain Kirk as a naughty boy. Number 1. The Doomsday Machine, Season 2. Guest starring William Wyndon as Commodore Decker. Searching for her lost sister ship, the USS Enterprise picks up an automated distress signal from the USS Constellation, NCC 1017. The Enterprise detects debris from what was once a star system. The two planets have been destroyed, and there were heavy subspace interference hindering communication with Starfleet. The Constellation would be adrift and heavily damaged. A scan would show life support still operating in some parts of the ship. Captain Kirk, Dr. McCoy, Mr. Scott, and a damaged control crew beam aboard the Constellation. They find the ship totally deserted. While heading to the auxiliary control, Captain Kirk finds someone sitting at the table. He is in shock, but he is identified as Commodore Decker, captain of the USS Constellation. He breaks down several times during his attempt to inform Captain Kirk on what happened. He later reveals that he had beamed his crew down to the planet's surface and stayed with his ship. To Captain Kirk's horror, it is learned that the planet was destroyed. Unable to beam up his crew, Commodore Decker had to listen to their cries for help as the planet was destroyed. Commodore Decker is brought back to the Enterprise for medical reasons. Captain Kirk stayed with Mr. Scott and a damaged control party to prepare the Constellation to be towed by the Enterprise. It is discovered quickly on what destroyed the planets and disabled the USS Constitution, as it would reappear and attack the Enterprise. Commodore Decker would assume command of the Enterprise and try to attack it, saying it needed to be stopped. Unable to do so, in fact, the Enterprise would be caught by the planet killer. Captain Kirk would see the Enterprise in trouble, and Mr. Scott would manage to get the USS Constellation moving again. He even had one fully charged phaser bank. The Constellation would fire on a planet killer, and as a result, it would let the Enterprise go. Angered that Commodore Decker took command of his ship and put it in such peril, Captain Kirk ordered Mr. Spock to retake command. Commodore Decker would later steal a shuttlecraft in an attempt to cause an overload and destroy the planet killer from the inside out. Ultimately, he is killed as the shuttlecraft explodes inside the maw of the planet killer. However, the Enterprise does detect a power drop, ever so slight, yet is still there. Captain Kirk has the idea to do the same thing with the USS Constellation. It is Captain Kirk who pilots the Constellation into the planet killer with the engines rigged to explode. Eventually, Mr. Scott gets the transporter working just before the Constellation explodes, and as a result, the planet killer power levels drop to nothing, and the planet killer is indeed dead. So what do you guys think of my episode list? Just about every episode of the original Star Trek is my favorite. But for time's sake, I made a list of the top 10. These are the ones that I watch the most. What are yours? You can put them in the comments below and compare lists. I hope you enjoyed my video, and until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Live long and prosper.